All right. Spike Cohan, who's a pretty big name in the libertarian movement, I think was VP. Uh, and Destiny, the debate bro himself. This is going to be a banger.
Ukraine as a NATO country, we would be watching American politicians explaining why, even though Ukraine is a NATO country, we're not going to start.
Russia would never invade a NATO country, though. That's the whole point. You said it yourself. Having nuclear weapons or that nuclear shield, it's one of the reasons why from 91 to 2014, Europe was an incredibly peaceful place. And even from 2014 to 2022, aside from the Ukrainian conflict, Europe has been far more stable than it was in the preceding 100 years.
So you're arguing for nuclear proliferation, but just under the aegis of the U.S. military.
I'm arguing for a nuclear shield where those nukes are managed by as few countries as possible.
So that's nuclear proliferation with extra steps.
If you think that nuclear proliferation with extra steps is the same thing as being in NATO and having the defense of the United States versus every independent, non-aligned country having nuclear weapons, I don't know what to say.
Well,
Are libertarian ideas actually going to work in the real world? So is libertarianism a pipe dream? Is it a fantasy? Does it actually work? Will it actually provide solutions? Streaming pioneer
Hell yes, it will.
Destiny believes that there are many challenges in the world that libertarianism simply can't provide solutions for. Do you agree? 2020 vice presidential candidate Spike Cohan is here to argue that if this philosophy was understood properly and applied consistently, libertarian philosophy absolutely provides these solutions. I am so excited for this debate. It's going to be moderately suave. So please help me welcome them to the stage, Robbie, Spike Cohan, and Destiny.
Right. Great to see everyone this morning. Hope you're all having a great time at LibertyCon. I know I am. I'm so excited to moderate this debate between Spike Cohan, VP of the Libertarian Ticket last time round, and Steven, aka Destiny, a streamer on YouTube and various platforms. So the topic is libertarianism, perfect solution or unrealistic fantasy. Probably most of us in the room thinks that, well, maybe it's a perfect solution, a solution of some kind. I think one of the most valuable things libertarians can do, or people who want to spread libertarian ideas, is have conversations, friendly conversations, with people who are interested in our ideas and want to engage with them in good faith. You know, if we only talk to ourselves, etc., it's fun, but at some point, what good is it accomplishing? So very excited to have this debate. Steven, I want to start with you and just to ask you to spend a few minutes engaging with the topic. What are the issues that you have with libertarianism? Where do you think the limits are, and what are the policy issues where it's not getting the job done?
Yeah, so I think the first question you always have to ask, and this is probably true even among libertarians, is when you say libertarianism, what exactly do you mean? Because I've heard everything from, it's almost like socialism, where some people will say it's everything from abolishing all private property all the way to like, well, it's just a heavily subsidized like welfare state or something. And then for libertarians, I've heard like answers as extreme as like anarcho-capitalism. There's absolutely no like formal arrangement of like any like third-party arbitrators or whatever that aren't just like private individuals agreeing to things, all the way to like, I've heard some people like...
So I don't think that's a fair description of anarcho-capitalism. A better description would be a system where the state is abolished and all the useful functions of the state are privatized. There would almost certainly be third-party arbitrators. What you wouldn't have is a state monopoly on justice or a state monopoly on dispute resolution.
A Ron Paul-esque person might say like, well, abolish the Fed and like have the government kind of back away from things. My kind of general problems with...
So broadly speaking, there are two strains of libertarianism, right libertarianism or libertarianism in the American sense, which are, as Destiny said, basically the Ron Paul limited government type and anarcho-capitalism, which is entirely free market, everything is privatized, zero government.
In like the most broadest sense, I think the three topics that I try to like kind of dance around, one is welfare, the idea that there are going to be some people in society that are just, are we allowed to cuss up here?
I have no idea.
So if the minimum wage were to be abolished, I think the number of people that couldn't earn any living in a free society would be extremely small. Even somebody who's in a wheelchair could still easily do a phone job, doing surveys or tech support, that sort of thing. Now, the minimum wage, especially at $16 an hour, does price a lot of people out of the marketplace, making them perpetually unemployed. And this is one thing you see a lot, which is one government policy perpetuates another, one intervention in the marketplace perpetuates another. But much more common is people that can work but choose not to, whether they want to pursue a drug or alcohol addiction, they're just really lazy. A lot of the time you have chronic welfare families where the children go on welfare because the parents were on welfare, and that's just sort of the way they learn to live. You know, I don't want to demonize people on welfare. I don't blame anybody for making the choices they have to make to survive in the system that they have to survive it. But I don't think there's really a strong case for state welfare. To the degree that there is some need, private charity, I think, could more than suffice without all the moral hazards of the state welfare system.
Some people in society are heavily disadvantaged also.
Say frat, maybe.
Sure, it's a frat. Some people in society are heavily disadvantaged, and there's not much incentive for other people to help them, say for hopefully family members if you can. So welfare is a big one. War, I think that foreign affairs are a very important part of like how the world functions and operates. And
the thing about war to me is that a libertarian society, especially an anarcho-capitalist society, basically cannot wage wars of aggression. It's very, very expensive to go to war, and there's not much profit in it. So you look at the war in Afghanistan or Iraq, trillions of dollars spent, very little accomplished. So no private company would ever be able to do that. They wouldn't be able to raise the funds to do it. They say, oh, we're going to go invade Iraq. People say, well, that's I'm not going to fund that. You go ahead, I guess. So it requires, in order to finance a war of aggression, it requires both the ability to levy taxes coercively and the ability to debase the money supply. In the olden days, the king would just clip coins. These days, they do it through central banking, through bank credit expansion. But inflation is very instrumental in having an imperialist warfare state because it allows the war to be paid for without the people really knowing it. If you had to raise taxes to the degree that you paid for a war up front, instead of monetizing the debt, then it would be very difficult to get the public to go along with it because they would see immediately the downside to them. So, to me, the great credit to the libertarian movement is a libertarian society would not be able to engage in wars of aggression. And that, I think, is very important because, as we see today, ostensibly the best countries in the world, these liberal democracies that, in the eyes of a person like Destiny are doing everything right. They're democratic. They've got these welfare states. They care, They're extremely bellicose. I mean, the United States aggressed in Vietnam, in Grenada, in Nicaragua. They bombed a medicine factory in Sudan that led to thousands of people dying because they couldn't get their medicine. They've supported all sorts of foreign dictators. The Gulf War 1 and 2, and England sort of right there along with them, intervening militarily. So I think waging wars of aggression is a terrible thing, and it's hubris to think that a nation can play the world's policeman or get involved overseas without making things worse. I mean, time and time again, American foreign intervention has blown up in their faces. At this point, it's like Lucy holding the football for Charlie Brown. I'm really going to let you kick it this time. this foreign intervention is really going to be a success, even though all these other ones were terrible failures that cost a huge amount of money and didn't really accomplish anything good.
People that are being represented by a government that can raise and recruit an army, that can intersect with other countries and represent on behalf of all the people. And then the third thing would be stuff related to like intellectual property or like patents. So for instance, like how do pharmaceutical companies protect their intellectual property in a libertarian society where there's not like a third party that's protecting like property rights or like patents or trademarks?
I think patents are another good point in the libertarian favor. Look at the high cost of prescription drugs, specifically those that are under patent, where other companies can't produce generic competitors to them. And people argue that without patents, then how would pharmaceutical companies be able to spend billions of dollars innovating on new drugs? Now, first of all, I don't think it would actually slow down progress that much, because really this is a question of scientific advancement, and the brilliant scientists who come up with these inventions, or rather who isolate the drug molecule or whatever, come up with the better form of the drug, the new drug. I mean, they're going to be doing the research regardless of whether or not a pharmaceutical company makes $100 billion a year. It's not like the pharmaceutical scientist is just going to become a janitor or something because we get rid of the patent system. I don't think that coming up with a new drug is just something you can pour like $100 million down a hole and you get a new drug. I don't think that's the process. Yes, I get that drug trials can be extremely expensive, although a lot of that too is regulatory compliance, which might not have the same cost in a libertarian society. But even if it was true and we didn't see all these hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested in clinical trials for new drugs, well, that's not the end of the story. As an economist, we had to see both what is seen and unseen. So where do those hundreds of billions of dollars go instead? Maybe they go to building housing or health or schools or factories. It's not like all that investment capital is just going to disappear into thin air, poof, because we get rid of the patent system. At the same time, patents can retard technological innovation. If you have a drug patented, then you're the only company that's selling it. But if any company can sell it, then any company will have an incentive to hire scientists to make a better version, to build a better mousetrap so that they can get more sales. Of course, we all know the harmful effects of patent trolls, and eliminating patent trolls would be one aspect of eliminating the patent system. And there's other things that companies can do, like protecting trade secrets. If you're first to market, you get an advantage just by being there first, building up that brand recognition. And frankly, the purpose of the legal system is not to ensure that Big Pharma makes $100 billion a year.
That's very interesting. Actually, I think if I were to make the argument I thought you were going to make and identify areas of libertarianism where I think there are good, more compelling, in my view, arguments against them, I'm not actually sure I would pick any of those. That's very, very interesting. Spike, how would you respond to this idea? And then maybe we'll get into the specifics of the ones he raised because they're very interesting.
Sure. So first of all, I want to give a couple caveats. I actually hurt my back. So if you see me suddenly wince, it's not necessarily because of something that Stephen or Robbie said, necessarily. And also, I'm on just enough painkillers to be able to get through this. So if you like Spike Cohan, you're going to love Spike Cohan on drugs. That will likely be the biggest applause line any of us get. Going to what Stephen said, and first of all, I agree that is part of the problem when we talk about these things. If we're talking libertarianism, are we talking anarcho-capitalism? Are we talking a night watchman state? So I think rather than get into a debate inside of a debate, I think it's better to just talk broadly about the idea behind libertarianism, and we can apply it to what we're talking about. So the three things you brought up were war, intellectual property, and welfare, right?
Yeah, the three W's. I'll say war, welfare, research. I'm so sorry. That's the only time I'll do it.
No, that's good. So we'll start with the, I guess the first one you did was welfare. I think first of all, and we probably agree on this, maybe we don't, that the first thing that any society should be doing when we're looking at how to help the poor is to stop creating weaponized systems that have the explicit intent of making and keeping them poor. So if you look at, for example, if you look at the ridiculous level of occupational licensing that we have, if you look at practices like over-criminalization, using the war on drugs, the war on guns, and all the other wars on victimless crimes, if you look at things like cash bail, if you look at things like the school-to-prison.
I'm not sure I can get behind this idea of elimination of cash bail. You know, as always, the devil is in the details, but I think bail is a pretty good solution for eliminating pretrial detention and trying to preserve that principle of innocent until proven guilty. Obviously, it depends on the crime, the severity of the crime, and that's taken into consideration at bail hearings. The more serious crime, the more bail money you should have to put up. But yeah, I mean, if it's a serious crime, people are just going to abscond. And if you have no barrier to absconding, the other alternative is to hold them pre-trial, in which case you're back to punishment by process. What if they're innocent? So maybe bail reform, you'd have to look at the specifics of the state or province involved. But I think just doing away with cash bail entirely is a pretty naive idea.
Line. Those are things that we probably agree on that we could be doing to eliminate the amount of poverty that's in a way being created. When it comes to welfare, the thing that I would say is that if we have eliminated that much welfare, if we look at welfare as sort of like a safety net, and if we start putting the rungs back on the ladder, getting rid of the excessive taxation, regulation, and overcriminalization that leads to so much poverty.
Look, the best safety net is a better economy, is higher paying jobs, entry-level jobs. The best safety net is high wage growth. If you look at during the Gilded Age, when there was very little government in America, wage rates were skyrocketing, as much as 48% in one decade. We haven't seen that sort of wage growth since the 1950s. With welfare, you're just paying people not to work. It's counterproductive. And there's tremendous moral hazard involved.
Stuck in a safety net are going to be able to climb out of it. If we also don't have a Federal Reserve that, in order to pay for the welfare state, the warfare state, and everything else, if we don't have a Federal Reserve and a monopoly on currency generation that is driving up the price of living because of monetary inflation, then many people won't be in any effective poverty. They may have the same amount of money, but that money will go further. And for those who still need help, you can use things like mutual aid and charity to get them out of the situation they're in and help them be able to get back on their feet. But the problem we have right now is that poverty has been, in many cases, made permanent and in a way sort of made into a generational problem instead of a temporary problem. And yeah, that would be hard to deal with just with charity or mutual aid. But simply.
Another problem here is what Knock wrote about, which is that every expanse of state power comes with a corresponding sapping of social power. So there'd be a lot of will to handle this problem, just people to people, for charity, if the state didn't monopolize welfare by taxing everybody and then setting up this bureaucracy. So people have this belief, because the state has been sapping social power for so long, that we as a society, we as individuals, can't do anything about these big problems. But in reality, private aid is a lot more targeted than state aid. If you see somebody that's drinking their life away or using drugs, you're probably not going to give them money and make the situation worse. Whereas the single mother trying to raise her children, a lot of people would be more receptive to donating to.
The government off a lot of these people's backs would do a credible amount of good. When it comes to war, we live in the country whose government is carrying out most of the war that's happening in the world. If you look at the I call it a genocide that's happening in Yemen, where the U.S. government is funding the Saudi government. And
so here's the situation in Yemen. 2014, the Saudi government led a coalition to invade a coalition of Arab states. Now, they're trying to restore the internationally recognized Abdurabu Mansur Hadi. Now, Mansur Hadi's a good guy. You know this because he was the sole candidate in the presidential election in 2012. He was backed by the ruling party as well as the parliamentary opposition, and he won 100% of the vote. So, extremely popular. So, basically, this guy Hadi, he was like a Western Saudi puppet who was installed, and then I guess the Iranians ousted him, and so Saudi Arabia, sort of backed by the West, invaded Yemen. So U.S. forces did offer logistical support, and there was a limited degree of direct U.S. involvement, but mostly they were just using U.S. equipment. And then, of course, the U.S. sent billions of dollars in aid to help rebuild Yemen afterwards.
carrying out something that looks even more brutal than what Russia is carrying out in Ukraine and has been going on for far longer. I think that the idea of having a long-term standing military, the problem is when government creates a program, they have to create a reason to expand it and a reason to continue it. And that's what we've seen with the war on terrorism, with the militarization of the war on drugs. That has been a continuation of a program, the Pentagon, that has to have a reason to continue itself. And so I would say that actually it's better to have a defensive force, and even if that is either a smaller military or some kind of a militia system or something like that, that's not what we have. We have a war machine, and it's costing lives here and abroad. It's costing us a fortune. It's certainly not making us any less.
Absolutely, very strong performance from Cohen here.
To intellectual property, I will admit that's probably the thing I know the least about of the things that we're talking about.
Well, and it's a thing that there's actually somewhat a range of libertarian views on.
I was going to say
there are some issues, that are still up for, obviously all issues are up for discussion, debate. But I know, very principled libertarian people who can take different sides on that issue.
You're a pro and anti-IP libertarian.
Yeah. By the way, if your back is still hurting later, I have some heroin in my room. So just kidding. If this is streaming, I don't want legalize heroin. Woohoo.
Legalize heroin. Not necessarily use heroin, but you should.
If this is streaming. So, Stephen, what I think you raised a good point when you said, like, what kind of libertarianism are we talking about? That is such a broad term. So I get annoyed when socialists do exactly what you just said. Say, well, yeah, I'm a socialist. I'm like, well, you mean that a revolutionary vanguard should seize the means of production from? It's not a system that works very well. And then they say, no, I just want more welfare. So I'm like, okay, it's not socialism. How do you feel about? I would say I'm directionally libertarian. I want to move the existing things we have in more of the direction that Spike was articulating. That okay, well, how can we if we have a welfare system, how can we subject it to some kind of market forces that will make it more efficient? If we have to have a military, how can we have it be more accountable to what the people actually want, which is oftentimes not what this war machine wants.
Is this guy asking a question or what? Get to the point.
If we have to have some kind of intellectual property, how can we have it so that innovation is still permitted and you're not just giving massive benefits to Pfizer and so on and so forth? How do you feel about directional libertarianism?
I love the concept of directional libertarianism as it can happen under a liberal style of economy and government. One of the biggest strengths, I think, of liberalism is it allows for a whole bunch of different economic and political philosophies to exist within it, and then to kind of function as they will within that system. So if you want to have a small town where you vote, we've got sanctuary cities.
Destiny coming out in favor of decentralization. I like it.
And say we're not going to cooperate with the federal government when it comes to turning in illegal immigrants. We've got states now that have legalized drugs that are still federally legal. You've got people that will run and form co-ops.
More states' rights.
in a capitalist society where generally you'd expect to see external capital and you'd expect to see shareholders and stuff. You've got workers that own the means of production, quite literally. I think that the advocation of certain libertarian ideas in terms of moving some things in a different direction, so like getting rid of...
I really wish it was like that, where you could have just radical experiments in different socio-political economic systems within a country, instead of basically the status quo everywhere being the exact same.
The war on drugs, I don't know who even supports that anymore. Well, probably older people.
There are a lot of people so unfortunate.
That maintain, yeah, well, a lot of boomers. But yeah, things like getting rid of the war on drugs.
Not to mention the police, conservatives.
I think is an overwhelmingly positive idea. Things like...
I mean, the vast majority of the population probably supports the criminalization of drugs. There's been so much propaganda around it, the demonization of drug traffickers, that at this point, I mean, I don't know. I would be surprised if 1 in 10 actually support full legalization.
Analyzing like, well, what is the application of military force that's appropriate across the world? You know, do we really want to be selling arms or be in bed with the Saudis when they are supporting genocidal regimes in Yemen? These are really good questions.
They're not supporting genocidal regimes in Yemen. They're engaged in a military genocide in Yemen. They are the genocidal regime. They're in Yemen.
And I love that under a liberal style of government, we're able to kind of like have all of those conversations. Whereas in a more hardcore libertarian style of government, if we wanted to have the conversation of there's a potentially important conflict brewing in Eastern Europe, what can we do? And everybody's like, well, I don't know. We don't have a military. We can't do anything. And it's like, oh, okay.
You care so much about it, you can go fight in that war.
Well, our options are far more limited under other styles of regimes, like say communism, socialism, or libertarianism, that I think that liberalism gives us the flexibility to address.
What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, we're talking about having different definitional issues. When you say liberalism, there are many people in here who actually consider themselves liberals, classical liberals. So when you're saying a liberal system, would you mind just...
Yeah, I guess when I say liberal system, so I'm talking about some form of like representative democracy combined with some form of like capitalist economy where the things that we value are like property rights, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, things that are like enshrined in our like Bill of Rights essentially.
Right.
Like in a very broad sense of like what it means to be a liberal.
Okay, so I mean, it almost sounds like a federalist system you're talking about, where a lot of the decisions are being made more locally than having a centrally planned from the absolute top, but where, like you said, different decisions are being made at a more local level for that community to kind of fit them. I just want to make sure I'm not missing.
Yeah, in a bit. I mean, I think the idea behind the United States is always that like a decision ought to be made as locally as possible.
I tend to agree with that. Kind of taking a step back on first principles, I think any form of governance, and this might also answer the minarchy versus anarchy question on how we're defining libertarian.
A debate we are going to have.
A debate we'll be having at
Also
3:30 if you want to do
You're going to be
that.
out of the chair.
But we'll avoid doing that with this time. I would say that in general, libertarianism, if you were applying it to how a system of governance would work, you would say that that system of governance would want to be as local, as feasible as possible. The decisions being made would be made by the actual stakeholders in a given situation as much as possible. The mechanism of funding for that system would be as voluntary as possible, and the ability to opt out would be as much as feasible and as possible. That could fit within a so-called...
The beauty of the decentralized model is that if the public don't like it, they can just vote with their feet. So you're going to have people moving from areas where their values are not being represented in the legal system to areas where they are. And you're going to end up with flourishing communities of different values across the country.
A night watchman, minarchist type of federalist state. And it's likely that, if we use the idea that central planning, that the more centralized decision-making is...
Another advantage is, when it comes to the federal government, you don't really have much influence on the federal government. It's located in the far distant capital, and you don't really have much say. But when it comes to local officials and local politics, it's a lot easier to make your voice heard.
The worse overall it's going to be and the worse the outcomes are going to be for the vast majority of people, then that would lend itself to that within any of those systems, some kind of democratic way of making those decisions would be the best way possible. So
I'm kind of curious then. So on my 3 prongs, focusing on the war side, let's say that Mexico tomorrow decides that they want to invade the libertarian states of America. What do you do?
Well, first of all, if you have...
Surrender.
have a well-armed populace, that's probably going to be not very feasible. I mean,
Mexico literally can't even defeat the cartels that are running rampant within their own border. The idea that they're going to try to invade a country that has 18 times their economy and 3 times their population is absurd. What does the United States of America do? Probably nothing. Texas alone could handle it. Do they even have nukes? Just drop a nuke on the CDMX.
one of the things that we've seen, there isn't a standing army that would be able to invade, forget a nation of 330 million well-armed people, even a state of a few million well-armed people. That's not a real thing. That's not feasible. They could maybe have an invasion and they could blow up buildings, but in terms of actually whatever goals they would have in a long-term invasion, being able to occupy, being able to take over.
Not to mention the productive capability of the rest of the country turned on a dime to produce military equipment and go and defend Texas or whatever that's getting invaded. I mean, is there even an example in history when a nation of such a strength disparity tried to conquer another nation that's 18 times their economy, 3 times their population, that's the richest country in the world? This seems like such an absurd hypothetical.
A well-armed populace. Now, it's not to say that you couldn't then have some kind of either a regular training system like a militia or something similar that could be called up. And the beauty of having it that way, instead of a standing army with military bases and weapons programs and everything else, is the impulse to use this thing that you have to justify the ever-growing budget that you need to have wouldn't be there.
So I like the idea David Friedman suggested of the Army organized along the lines of a nonprofit. You've got a small group of professional soldiers and then vast armies of reservists who would volunteer to serve and, you know, get together every couple weeks or so, run a few drills, what have you.
Ready and on call, but couldn't be used for, widespread world policement.
And that's the more important thing. Whatever problems a libertarian society might have in waging wars, defensive wars, they could not wage wars of aggression. And that's so much more important because wars of aggression are what threaten the existence of the human race, the stability of the world. At the very least, the libertarian country is making the move towards world peace.
In type style.
Well, so let's in addition to what you're saying, that you're more likely to get invaded by Mexico if you have the kind of vast police and national intelligence and agency forces that the government has.
So I've heard this argument before, but let's lean a little bit more into this. So I think you can invade a well-armed population very easily. You would just be killing them all, right? Like, holding territory and having the citizens being like subservient to you while they're all well-armed and hate you is probably much more difficult. But if we were talking about like an invasion into like New Mexico or Texas, which is mostly empty land, save for like a couple of big cities, it'd be pretty easy for another country to make big territorial gains. The only people that could resist a formal army would be like individually trained citizens.
So they're just going to kill, tens of millions of people? When did the Mexicans become the most evil people in the world?
Ability for like individual citizens in like a state, like are people from Austin going to drive over to like El Paso to like defend that city?
Right. So again, it's not necessarily that you wouldn't have some kind of ability to have a force to call up when and if needed. And if they decided they wanted to have some minimal presence to be able to make sure if something happened, there was something there. Also, if we're going to the hypothetical of the Mexican army deciding that it wants to wage a campaign of genocide, of actually going in and killing everyone, it's likely that there would be some indicators beforehand, like this isn't going to happen tomorrow, right? So if that were the case, then there would be able to be that, okay, well, this looks like this is something that's going to be happening. We can,
like, maybe they would start with some of their easier to defeat neighbors if that was their intent. Why are the Mexicans even doing this in the first place?
We've had regularly training for this type of thing. But that's to go from that step to say that another government could do something could decide they want to commit genocide and invade, and therefore we should have. I want to make sure we're in agreement that we should not have the military-industrial complex we have now. Is that
I
correct?
love the military-industrial complex.
Okay, so and you're saying that unironically.
Yes.
Okay, all right. So,
What I'm going to avoid, because I'm sure you've probably been on this dialogue a million times, but the questions I'm going to start to ask are going to be like, so you think that we should have a group of people that we could call up when needed, they're getting some type of regular training,
Yeah.
we're probably making some sort of investment into like arming them, we're probably having some kind of logistic. At some point, are we kind of just rebuilding the military?
Yes, you're going to have a national defense. It's going to be one supplied by a nonprofit, not the state, and it's not going to be a standing army.
no, because it's the idea is if you have something that's there that exists, it turns into what we have now. And I want to make clear what we have right now. What we have right now costs us over $1 trillion a year. It has cost us, just in my time, it has cost tens of thousands of American lives in combat. It has cost countless, but millions of innocent lives overseas. It has cost hundreds of thousands more veterans who have come back with traumatic brain injuries and all sorts of other chronic health problems and mental health problems who, for a variety of reasons, end up either dying early or taking their own lives. It has cost trillions of dollars, actually tens of trillions of dollars. It has cost the almost immeasurable amount of inflation we have had, because much of that has been funded through Federal Reserve printing of notes to lend to the Treasury Department, which devalues your currency and causes the cost of your living to go up. And the biggest thing that they can show that they have done with this military-industrial complex in the last 20 years was to replace the Taliban with a better armed Taliban that we paid for the armaments for. So the idea of a military, I mean, that's certainly...
Well, and also,
Also, wait, hold on, wait. So there are great costs to the First Amendment. Would you agree to that?
I
freedom
believe
of
that
speech
there are, but I don't believe that a invasive...
That's fine, but I'm saying there are,
state.
the First Amendment comes with it the ability to do an almost unmeasurable amount of harm to society with the type of speech that you proliferate in society, which is okay, because we've decided that even though there might be some great costs associated with allowing anybody a platform to speak, in the United States, we feel so strongly about that right that we're willing to accept the trade-offs for the benefit of having that right.
But
So
who's the
we
we
talk
in the
about-
military-industrial complex?
The we is the existence of the United States is essentially like the leader of the free world.
But even from
it's
the
ability
liberal-
to ensure our trade routes, it's the ability to maintain leadership across conflicts across the world. It might be the ability to help a country like Ukraine resist what was thought to be the second. And that's something that we wouldn't be able to do if we didn't have the military investment that we did. But
I mean, look at the degree of military spending. America spends way more than any other nation around the world. They can easily spend a fraction of that and still be completely safe. They've got the strong national defense of the oceans and location in North America. A lot of the military-industrial complex actually harms their national defense because you go around angering people, dropping bombs on them, and turning them into terrorists. Anytime you have this massive military machinery, you're going to have the temptation to use it. That's what the primary cause of imperialism is. I don't think defending trade routes, and what are these trade routes under threat from exactly? German submarines, Barbary pirates? Is there some threat to global trade I'm not aware of? Or the ability to unload used military equipment to help Ukraine fight your proxy war for you is really justification for the massive cost of the military-industrial complex, to say nothing about the stability caused by military intervention around the world. Look, it's the 21st century. We should be looking to unilaterally disarm or find disarmament. We shouldn't be seeking militarization. We should be turning our swords into plowshares. There should be a dawn of a new era where we put our warlike lanes behind us and learn to live in peace and cooperate with our fellow man. I mean, the reality is that America has been the most warlike country since the end of World War II. America has been involved in so many military conflicts around the world, and I just don't see any justification for it.
Of sort of liberal democracy. I mean, these are decisions not being made. They're not subject to democratic forces at this point. They're not accountable because there's no.
Wait, what's not subject to
There's no
democratic
congressional. These wars are not being congressionally authorized anymore.
The Ukraine funding is all stuff we're voting on. Like we voted on
the Libya replacement, the Syria involvement, the drone deaths of various.
We don't directly vote on every single thing, but we have representatives. If we really don't like things, and that starts to dictate like who we vote for. That's
I feel like I'm doing the meme where we're saying, how did my freedoms get over in Afghanistan and Iraq? How is what the military-industrial complex has done largely in the Middle East and the global South, how is that something that has protected my right to freedom of speech or my rights, especially considering that coupled with that military-industrial complex is the internal surveillance state complex, which we have found out means the government keeping track of basically every single thing we do, every single electronic communication we make. How is that protecting or preserving any right?
Yeah, so there's not going to be, I can't defend every single aspect of how the United States military or government conducts itself. Like I said, I think rightfully there are a lot of criticisms that one could make of how the government and the military-industrial complex conducts itself. But when I look at things like, for instance, the conflict occurring in Ukraine, only the United States could have been the leader needed in that situation to give Ukraine the tools they needed and to get other countries on board with being able to.
But is that such a good thing, or are you just unnecessarily prolonging the war? It's not like Ukraine has won the war and the war is over. So if funding Ukraine makes the war last 2 or 3 years longer than it otherwise would have, regardless of who wins, how is that really a victory, except for the cynical position of you're causing the Russians to bleed themselves? And what if the Ukraine conflict escalates into nuclear first strike? Is seeking a conflict with a nuclear power really that bright?
To resist Russia in the way that they have. But that's something that only the United States could have done.
But someone would say that has brought us precipitously closer to nuclear war.
Do what?
Some people would say that the contributions we've made have brought the entire planet.
Most people would be wrong, right? What's brought us closer to nuclear war is Russia being an aggressive invader.
Well, even putting that argument aside.
But you can't do anything about the fact that Russia is being an aggressive invader. You can only control your actions. You can't control Russia's actions.
It's not as though the military-industrial complex, like the U.S. military is not invaded or I shouldn't say invaded, has not intervened there, there's been no bombing.
No, but weapons that we've developed, systems that we've invested in, weapons that we've sold to other countries that we've gotten on board with our military training, other countries that we've coordinated with because of the size of the military. If the United States is a libertarian country, why would Germany, France, Poland, the UK listen to us when it comes to leading in conflicts in Eastern Europe?
Why would they not listen to us if we were demonstrating that we were leading the world in peace instead of war?
Because you can't lead the world if you're a completely isolated country with no ability to project power anywhere else in the world either.
There is a difference between isolationism and non-interventionism. So the idea, if we distill it down, the idea that there's either we have to be the main warmongers in the world or be isolated, distilled down as saying you either have to punch everyone in the face that you walk up to or never talk to anyone. I reject that argument.
I'm talking about punching everybody in the face, but again,
that's essentially, U.S. foreign policy is essentially you're either on our side or we're punching you in the face, or actually killing lots of you.
There are lots of non-aligned states around the world that the United States, believe it or not, doesn't have an interest in. Now, we have a lot of allies that do things as well. Like, it's not like the United States has drones in Yemen because we just hate Yemen people, right? It's because of our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which I admit does get more complicated. And I think there's room for criticism there. But again, to focus on probably the most important conflict right now militarily happening over the last 10 years would be what's going on in Ukraine. And only the United States would have been in a position to take point in that, because Russia isn't playing by a libertarian rule book. They're playing by like a totalitarian, authoritarian rule book.
But that's not correct, because the most of what is happening in Europe is actually European states that are getting involved, including obviously Ukraine.
European states at the behest of who, though? Who was the one that brought all of these states to the table? What alliance was?
Wait, so are you saying, so if Ukraine says we're being invaded by Russia, you would be next because you're right behind us, please help. It requires a country on the other side of the planet saying, yes, I think you should help them to make that happen? I don't.
The United States is the de facto head of NATO, of course, yeah.
Let's take a step back, though. I don't think Spike is saying, and are you saying that you wouldn't be, you're not a libertarian nation or a libertarian organization if you have a standing military? I'm not sure I would say that.
I'm saying that
we were arguing for libertarianism, not anarchy. Well, some people would argue for anarchy, but
the military is an important part of it. It's a game
of fundamental. That's one of the fundamental things, right? That many libertarians would say is something government can do.
Yeah, but they would say only defense, and that any type of like foreign intervention would be by definition like not defensive.
Well, it's not.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think
So we are having that argument.
yeah, but I mean, the issue is that like when you have other countries, it's kind of like a game theory-esque thing. Sometimes when I ask socialists or communists, I say, how are you going to make your country competitive with other economies around the world if you guys are investing so much more into things like workers or whatever, and you're not investing into like better products, right? Because you want to protect worker rights, which is admirable. But their answer is always,
It doesn't matter. The law of comparative advantage says even if one country is better at producing both socks and cars than another country, they can still benefit from specialization.
well, we would need a global socialist revolution. It's like, okay, so insofar as you have because then you ask them, well, why haven't any communist socialist countries succeeded? They go, well, it's because of all the evil countries around them that are ruining them. It's like, okay, so it seems like you have to have some level of self-sufficiency, some level of self-assuredness, some form of economy and some style of government that allows you to resist external pressure. And I haven't seen a libertarian style of government that's capable of doing that. And then when I look at how other countries around the world function, like say Russia, I don't think Ukraine would want the United States or Germany or France or Poland or UK to be healthy, independent libertarian countries. They probably want them to be very liberal governments that have militaries that are being funded and supported by the people that can send arms and help over to Ukraine to help them resist Russia.
Well, I think right now the Ukraine probably wishes that there hadn't been a strong interventionist U.S. who convinced them to give up their nuclear weapons in exchange for a promise of peace. Because right now, if you'll recall, with the breakup of the Soviet Union at one point, the Ukraine had the second or third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons. And the U.S. and Russia, in their nuclear non-proliferation strategy, which means only we get to have nukes, they went to Ukraine and offered security assurances, which you can see what those were worth, in exchange for the promise of, in exchange for them giving up their nukes to Russia, which is interesting. So basically what they were saying is, if you give up your nukes, then the two countries who are the most likely to invade you at some point or intervene at some point, we totally promise that we won't do that. And within a span of one generation, that obviously has been broken, because this started at least in 2014 with the invasion and annexing of Crimea.
So this was a thing. It was in 1994. It was called the Budapest Memorandum. And It is true that Russia and the United States had Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and one other nation where they said, we're going to move all of your nuclear weapons out in exchange for some promise of territorial sovereignty. Yeah. But the issue is that Ukraine didn't want to manage those nuclear weapons. It was like over 1,600 active nuclear weapons in what would become one of the most corrupt states in the entire world. I think that it was probably a score for every single person that the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine were moved out of Ukraine. As much as I don't like Russia, I probably want that active nuclear arsenal being managed by Russia rather than in Ukraine that was a corrupt, incredibly messed up state that couldn't even afford the proper maintenance of those weapons.
I think that the Ukrainians would disagree with you at the moment, but putting that
aside,
they
might disagree at the moment, but they voted for the Budapest Memorandum as much as anybody else did. It's not like we forced it on them. They agreed to that treaty. They couldn't manage that nuclear arsenal.
Yes, this is an argument against this kind of style of foreign policy. Do
you think it's better for more countries to have nuclear weapons? Should every country have a nuclear weapon?
I don't know necessarily that every country should have nuclear weapons, but I think it's quite a coincidence that the only countries that have even been remotely subject to invasion from the U.S. or from Russia or any other of these aggressive states have been countries that haven't had nuclear arms.
And the only country that had nuclear weapons used on them was used by us.
Yes, yeah. And another side note here: the only time in the entire history of nuclear weapons that they have been used was when only one party had them, and that was when the dropping of Fat Man and Little Boy on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I'm not sure if I did those correctly, but and then with just one other state having nuclear weapons. As soon as Russia got them, and certainly Russia was not a good actor, but one other state having it was enough for that to be off the table as just being the new way of doing, replacing carpet bombing with nuke bombing, which obviously has been.
I think the more salient point about nuclear weapons is that both the American and the Russian governments spent enough money to blow up the world 10 times over with nuclear bombs. So this is the sort of waste of resources you see with government. No private individual would fund such a ludicrous thing, and yet because of how the state functions, For many years, our species was on the brink of nuclear annihilation. Is it any wonder that the great filter is a thing? You look at the foolish decisions that we as a species made with regards to nuclear weapons and this policy of mutual assured destruction.
Been a good thing. So I would say that the nuclear non-proliferation strategy taken to its logical step is about effective as a no-gun zone in a school, right? You're saying that only the bad actor is going to have this. Putting that aside, I don't think that necessarily the Ukrainian government would have decided, yes, we're going to keep this entire stockpile of weapons. But by having this U.S. world policeman style of foreign policy, they said, oh, listen, we're the world police, we'll take care of you. All you have to do is give up your nukes. Well, that failed. And the reason it failed is because, frankly, if the people that were looking at this Budapest memorandum at the first place would have realized the United States government, as everyone from Joe Biden and everyone in the government has said, even AOC has said this, is that the United States government is not going to intervene in a hot war with the other largest nuclear power on the planet. So